Welcome to another episode of Noah Knows, the science of health and fitness. I am the bearded bullshit buster and swolly scientist, and today we're getting gut checked by science. That's right, our guest is none other than PhD Gabrielle Fundaro, who is a human nutrition expert and also a gut health expert. Gabrielle, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That's a very gracious introduction, using the word that I try not to let anyone say about me.
What word is that?
Expert, gut health expert.
Okay, so what would you like to be called then?
So it was so funny. I talked about this when I was on with Omar and Eric and on the Iron Culture podcast and trying to find a good word. And I think at my core, I still value myself, consider myself an educator and communicator. So that's usually what I try to say, that I'm, an evidence-based gut microbiome educator.
Okay, that is totally fair. So one of the things I would like to do to help our listeners and our viewers relate to you is a deep dive on your Instagram, and I actually do have a photo here that I'm going to show you. Now, I notice on your Instagram you have lots of dogs and lots of cats, but there's specifically one photo that I'd like you to look at and explain to me. And so what we'll do in the video feed is we'll throw up the actual image, but I'm going to show the image to you right now. Can you see that clearly?
Yes.
Talk to us. What's going on in this photo?
So this is a spaghetti squash that I prepped in the microwave, and you're supposed to stab them repeatedly so that the air can escape, the steam can escape as you're microwaving it. And I guess I didn't do that sufficiently, so it just cracked. And that's just my sick, twisted sense of humor. I was like, oh, this thing looks like it's suffering. Let's anthropomorphize it and make it look even worse.
So it explodes, and let's draw googly eyes on it. That's
Yes.
fantastic. Did it looked like, it had seen better days, but how did it taste?
Oh, totally normal. It was still and I don't even really do much with butternut and spaghetti squash anymore, because it's such a pain in the ass to prep those things. But yeah, it actually made it a little bit easier, because then I could just tear it apart and, its gaping maw, and scrape out its insides and eat it. It's delicious.
All right. Go cannibalistic on it. You already exploded it. What else can we do to it, right?
Yeah.
So, I wanna treat this episode as an introduction or a 101 into human nutrition and gut health, because what you specialize in, what you educate people on, is so buzzworthy, right? It is, but people talk about oh, gut health, it's so important to me. Do you even understand, not you, but those people, do you even understand what gut health is, right? So let's start off. What is gut health?
That is the $1 million question. And it's usually what I try to ask people when they say something like, oh, a X product is good for gut health, or it will heal your gut. Because when we look at the gut, and right now what we're looking at gut health as sort of two separate entities that are interrelated, but people are talking about them as their one thing. So gut health can be looking at the anatomy and physiology of the gastrointestinal tract. So is it free of disease? Is it functioning normally in terms of producing comfortable bowel movements and manageable amounts of gas? How are we feeling in terms of gastrointestinal comfort after specific foods? So we have sort of the anatomy and physiology. We have our perceptions of how our digestive tract is feeling. And then we have the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome refers to all of the microbes and their genetic material that inhabit the gastrointestinal tract. And while those two are definitely connected, tightly connected, they're two separate topics of discussion.
Right.
So something that might be really great for the microbiome, like prebiotic fibers that they can use as an energy source, might lead to the production of gases that cause distension and bloating and discomfort and diarrhea.
Right.
And we consider that to be bad gut health. So what might be good for the microbiota might cause us some discomfort. And so when people are talking about, what is gut health, I think it depends on what that person is talking about. And so we're trying to mush these together, like and yes, eating a plant-based diet is great for health outcomes. It may also be great for microbial diversity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if you have increased microbial diversity that you're going to be free of gastrointestinal distress.
Right.
So we sort of conflate these two topics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great transition here is to talk about fiber. Like we all know that fiber is good, but
Yes.
I would think a lot of people don't understand that too much fiber can be bad and can cause distress. So let's keep it real simple here. What would you say is the appropriate amount of fiber for a man and a woman, and what is the level of fiber that becomes too much where we know it starts to actually strip out nutrients from our body?
So the recommendations in the US would be 25 grams a day for women and 38 grams a day for men. Now that would be a combination of both soluble fibers, which get sort of mushy when you add water to them, and insoluble fibers, which generally maintain their structure when we add water. Those soluble fibers are really the primary nutrient sources for the bacteria. The insoluble fiber helps to create bulk. It looks like the upper limit of fiber intake in the US, and based on just kind of the evidence that we have thus far, probably people will start to experience some GI distress upwards of 70 or more grams of fiber per day.
That is a lot of fiber.
Well, but in other cultures that are, agrarian, really subsisting on almost entirely a plant-based diet, they may be ingesting 100 to 150 grams of fiber per day. So in things like the Hadza, which is a group whose microbiomes have been studied extensively, that's a fairly normal intake for them. And their gastrointestinal tracts have adapted to that level of fiber intake. So it kind of is also person specific. Some people may be a little bit more sensitive to specific types of fibers or fermentable carbohydrates. And so they might get even a little bit more specific than just, 25 to 38 grams, also looking at sort of specific individual tolerability.
Yeah, that's interesting when you started to talk about people adjusting to that type of diet. Is that something that higher realm of 100 plus grams of fiber in a day? Is that something that like anyone can adjust to, or like what's the adaptation period on something like that?
Well, it looks like the microbiome, so the actual microbes, adapt to dietary changes beginning within about 24 hours. And we can see some pretty significant shifts within 5 days at the extremes of dietary intake. So say switching from 100% animal-based, something looking like carnivore with cheese, to something that's completely plant-based, or vice versa. So we do see some rapid adaptations in specific groups of microbes. Now, where that comes into play for how we might experience GI distress is that it's the microbes that are actually breaking down those fibers and producing gas. So this could have more than two possible outcomes, but kind of the major two outcomes would be, it could be a good thing to clear that fiber out of the colon, because that fiber can pull in a lot of water and cause distension and bloating and discomfort. So if we're clearing out those fibers, that could potentially be a good thing to mitigate some of that discomfort. So we may want more of the bacteria that produce the enzymes to break down those fibers. On the other hand, if those bacteria are breaking down fibers and then producing a lot of gas, that also could cause us some discomfort. But they may instead be producing short-chain fatty acids, which wouldn't necessarily cause us as much gastrointestinal distress. So we could potentially adapt, but again, we don't really have great data on how much we can adapt to or how long it would take for us to see a change in symptoms.
Right, and one of the things I want to capitalize there is we don't really know, right? And this is the thing. You're an educator. You're one of the top educated in the country in the field.
Thank you.
You know, you represent the ISSN, the International Society for Sports Nutrition. You represent Renaissance Periodization, which is one of the best training and diet companies in the world, which is fantastic. You work alongside people like Mike Israetel. You know, you and your colleagues are some of the leading, we'll say, educators, because we don't like the word experts, but educators in the world, arguably. And when you say we don't fully understand the process yet, does it make you die a little bit inside when you see people on Instagram that absolutely definitively black and white hammer home, this is what we need to do? Like, if you don't know, what are the chances that the recommendations that your favorite Instagram person knows better than you?
There's a plaque that used to hang in one of my old apartments. It said something like, absolute certainty is a privilege of fanatics and uneducated minds. So, you know, we all have biases and we all have sort of our darlings in the field, and I certainly have had them as well. And I think that one value and one strength, because I'll be confident here and a little less humble, is that I think about things and I look at different perspectives and I keep an open mind. Not so much that things fall out, but enough that I can synthesize various sources of information and also evaluate them. So I think that's one thing that might be lacking in individuals who make these statements with a great deal of certainty and not enough context and nuance. And, you know, I think it can happen across the board. I certainly have done it in the past. So I try not to judge too harshly. Where I really get frustrated is when they use that sort of manipulative, fear-based marketing against
Game
people
changers.
who, yes, yeah, exactly. Or, you know, looking at certain people who will pick out just like a specific chemical and then make that sound really scary, and they're using that to you know, basically make money off of people who might not know any better.
Oh yeah, and that's the bottom line is they're doing it because people are so desperate that
Yes.
they're willing to buy anything, and they know that they can continue to get them to buy into things. Now, because we want to treat this as a 101, let's define another term here, because this is another term that goes hand in hand with your field, and that's bioavailability. That's another big buzzword. What is that? Can you help us, enlighten us?
That would basically be our body's ability to extract nutrients from a food source. So there may be some characteristics of, for example, you know, plant-based nutrients versus animal-based nutrients that reduces the efficacy of our digestive enzymes to break down those foodstuffs to the smallest constituent parts so that we can actually utilize that as energy.
Okay.
Or to, you know, just if it's not something that's going to be used as energy, but just to be able to extract, you know, a micronutrient from that.
All right. So I bring up bioavailability because I want to reference a post that Susan, and I hope I'm not butchering the last name here, Devkota, Susan Devkota. She recently did a podcast with Lane Norton and Holly Baxter and was talking about bioavailability. And she was talking about this current trend of like probiotic cereals and probiotic snacks and how these are not living cultures, and you know they may say probiotic on it, but they're not living. There's no real bioavailability. Take us through the recommendations. If there's a product to buy out there, like say it's a probiotic or not necessarily a probiotic specifically, what are the products someone should look for in buying something like this, and what are the products that people should stay away from?
So I want to point out a couple caveats about probiotics and probiotic supplementation. One would be that there is no kitchen sink probiotic that we need to, or probiotic blend that we should be trying to get every day. That the thus far, the evidence illustrates that the effects of probiotics are extremely specific in terms of strain or subspecies and also disease state. So taking just a kitchen sink blend, it's sort of like taking a pre-workout with a bunch of crap added to it that's not dosed at physiologically relevant levels. Like say you've got 600 grams of caffeine or 600 mgs of caffeine and then like 1 gram of creatine. You take 3 grams of creatine's worth of that pre-workout, you will probably die from your heart exploding from taking 1.8 grams of creatine or of caffeine. So it's just sort of a marketing ploy that they're adding all of these probiotics. Now, the probiotics don't necessarily need to be living to potentially exert an effect in the microbiome, nor do they need to take up residence in the microbiome. So we do have some evidence that they can sort of pass through and have transient effects at the gene expression level in the microbiome. So that's one thing. They don't necessarily need to be alive, but we do find that they probably need to be dosed sufficiently. And that dose is somewhere between 1 to 5 billion CFUs. We don't know what we're going to be getting in foodstuffs, nor do we know that some of the strains that are found in foodstuffs will actually be able to interact with our existing microbes in a meaningful way.
Yeah. I mean, and that's incredibly important. I think most people are incredibly negligent about or unaware of. They just go into Vitamin Shop or GNC or whatever it is, and they say, 8 billion cultures, right? And they just take it. It sounds like what you're saying is that they could potentially be buying something that if the strain isn't specific to like their GI or their gut health in particular, they could be taking a product that does absolutely nothing because it's not, the right specific strain for their body. Now, if that is the case, what is the best way for someone to figure out what the specific dosage or what the specific strain is they would need to take so they're not just buying something that's totally irrelevant to them?
Yeah, so they would want to take it even one step back from that and look at what is wrong with my gut right now. If they're experiencing diarrhea, then a probiotic might actually be helpful to them. So it could be antibiotic-associated diarrhea, could be traveler's diarrhea, so an infectious diarrhea. Sometimes pediatric diarrhea will also respond to a select few strains of probiotic bacteria. So that could be one potential intervention. If they have an inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, or if they have irritable bowel syndrome, there are, again, a few strains and even some blends that may be helpful in modest reduction of their symptoms in combination with an actual pharmaceutical drug in the case of IBD. Aside from that, there's really not a lot of evidence that probiotics are going to do much of anything else. We don't have strong evidence that they improve mood. We don't have strong evidence that they have an appreciable effect on body composition or on what's the other one that people are always trying to, weight loss. So it's just not like, if you don't have gastrointestinal distress, and even not, it doesn't even really help so much with constipation. It's got to be kind of specifically diarrhea.
Right.
Don't bother. Because when we look at the effects in healthy individuals, there's no effect on the microbiome, no changes in gene expression, although those studies are a little more limited, and really no change in clinical outcomes. So why?
Yeah. It's like most things in life. We should be looking at preventative measures instead of reactionary, right?
Yes.
Now, there was something, another question I wanted to bring up, and you talked about like body composition and weight loss and stuff like that. The amount of times I've heard someone be like, "Oh, well, like I'm not losing weight because I'm not digesting properly. As soon as I get a probiotic, I'll just start losing weight again." Is there any truth to this whatsoever that a probiotic could help or like stop you from losing weight, even if you're in a calorie deficit? That doesn't seem like science to me. Please.
Yeah, exactly. So now this is an area where we do have some conflicting evidence. And so it kind of depends on, when you look at the systematic reviews and things like that, you really, in this case, have to look at the individual papers. Like, what are they actually looking at in these? What types of interventions are they actually performing with these individuals? Are they doing a probiotic and then also doing, caloric restriction or something like that? So with weight loss and with caloric restriction, we can see changes in the microbiota. That could be something that's happening independent of the probiotic.
Right.
Thus far, there's very weak evidence that probiotic supplementation might help with high-fat diet associated dyslipidemia and insulin resistance. That doesn't necessarily translate to weight loss, although in some cases we do see reductions in waist circumference, but that could be changes in bloating as well. So waist circumference isn't necessarily just indicative of body fat.
Right. So,
but the strength of the evidence is like, because we see so many studies that show no effect.
Right. So this may likely be correlation isn't causation, right? If somebody's losing weight and they're taking a probiotic, their improvement in overall health is likely attributed to the fact that they're losing weight, not necessarily the supplementation of the probiotic, right?
Yes, exactly.
Fantastic. That's what I like to hear. Something else that I wanted to address with you, and again, Susan Devkata, during her podcast with Lane Norton, Holly Baxter, they were talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I misunderstood this, but how the gut health of someone's diet, just because you're vegan or just because you're plant-based doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have good gut health. That someone who is as restrictive as a vegan is probably has just as poor gut health as someone who's going carnivore or any other type of restricted type of diet, and that really the most phosphoring thing for the best gut health is going to be diversity. Is this an accurate statement? And let's define diversity.
This is really interesting, because had you asked me a few weeks ago, I probably would have agreed more with that statement.
Really?
So there have actually been some new articles that have just come out in recent weeks. One was a systematic review in conjunction with an RCT, looking at vegan versus vegetarian versus omnivorous diets. And so I really did a deep dive into the available literature, and there's not a lot. There have been just a couple systematic reviews on comparing vegan, vegetarian, and omnivorous diets. And I did that really because, Game Changers coming out and like people are really asking these questions. Right. So diversity refers to when we're looking, and we can look at this with any type of ecosystem, we want to see the richness, so the number of different species, and then also the evenness, so the relative abundance of species. And ideally, we have a higher representation of beneficial or neutral microbes and a lower representation of potential pathogenic microbes. And as humans, we have sort of a core microbiome. So there are some microbes that we want to see in everyone at pretty much the similar level. So all healthy individuals usually will have, for example, a strong representation of F. prausnitzii. And if we see that that's significantly suppressed, that often is concurrent with some disease state. Now, there can be changes in diversity or changes in the relative abundance of species that are linked to, correlated with specific disease states, but not all changes in diversity can be considered quote unquote good or quote unquote bad. Sometimes they're just changes. We just don't know what the clinical outcomes might be. And it's really just an ecosystem adapting to challenges. So changes in nutrient availability. So what we've actually found looking at the gut microbiota of vegans, vegetarians, and omnivores is that because of the heterogeneity of studies and because there's so much inter-individual variability, so about 60 to 80% of our microbiome is individual to us and stays with us through pretty much our entire lives, from when we start introducing food to when we get old. So just that's just a fingerprint in between two individuals.
It's funny that you say fingerprint, because that's the first thing that immediately jumped in my mind is like,
Yes.
this is like our internal fingerprint, right? We have our
Yes.
fingerprints on our hand that are unique and unique to us alone. But from what it really seems like, you're suggesting here, and I'm going to defer to you, obviously, is that it's just as unique and individual to us as well. And this is exactly why it pays to continue to keep up with science, because I'm asking you a question that, had we scheduled this a week or two earlier, your answer would have been possibly completely different, right? And I think that is the great hallmark of a good scientist, is that you're willing to look at the evidence and change your previous statement or your previous understanding based on new evidence, right? And that's fantastic. I did not know that, and that's great. I'm incredibly thankful that we're having this conversation right now. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. But yeah, so when we look at the differences, it's actually fairly minor, that vegetarians and vegans look really very similar in many cases. And vegetarians and omnivores look very similar in many cases. And vegans and omnivores even aren't really that different. And what's especially problematic is even when we're comparing vegans from different areas, is that vegans will see some differences. So in some cases, they'll have higher levels or lower levels, for example, of a group called Bacteroidetes or Bacteroides. And some of that is just reflecting the dynamism of these microbes, that they can adapt. If we're having a really high plant matter diet or a really high animal matter diet, some of them are just kind of not fussed about that. They'll just sort of metabolize whatever nutrients are available. But the one thing that I will say is that when we look at the effects of just a purely animal-based diet, so devoid of fiber, devoid even of polysaccharides, so this would be something looking like a carnivore diet,
right?
That in that case, we actually do see significant perturbations to sort of the shape of the ecosystem there. So we see a reduction in the mucus lining of the that covers the intestine, so a protective mucus layer, because that is actually a rich source of carbohydrates for those bacteria. So they'll turn to that if they don't have a source of dietary carbohydrates coming from us. And we also see some significant changes in populations longitudinally across from small intestine to large intestine. So it looks like fiber deprivation and polysaccharide or carbohydrate deprivation, those will have significant impacts. So that's probably what we would want to avoid. Whether you want to be vegan or vegetarian or omnivorous, if you have sufficient fiber intake, and in all cases, you're going to have carbohydrate intake, that's probably not going to be too problematic. And so we don't see big shifts with that. But it's when we shift to 100% just animal diet, that's when we see significant shifts in the ecosystem that could potentially be problematic.
Right. So I want to touch on a couple of things here. So, we've talked about, bioavailability with animal-based proteins, and how, carbs are great, and fiber and all that stuff like that. So it really seems like, again, diversity or having just, a well-balanced diet, the simple thing that we always talk about, not needing to become zealoted or tie morals to food or something like that, is really the best option. That's just kind of my subjective view on it. So please help us. Like, what in your mind, or like in the simplest way possible, like go over what is the best diet, and please let me preface this and make sure there is no such thing as the best diet out there. Please do not jump on me on this, but overall view, right? If you were to pick out or lay out, like, boom, these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things to have in your diet for best gut health, what would you say that?
It looks thus far that evidence would support what we call microbe accessible carbohydrates. So those are carbohydrates that are not necessarily digestible by your human enzymes. So they pass from the small intestine all the way to the colon, and that's where they can be fermented. So we recognize these as sort of the FODMAPs. So those are fermentable carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
Now, FODMAPs can cause some GI distress, absolutely. So it's not to say that more is better. It's just to say that those are important for supporting microbial diversity, the correct spatiation of those microbes across the gut, and the support of our intestinal cells and the protective mucus layer. So that looks to be what is the most important thing. And fiber would be, dietary fiber would be a subset of that, but not all FODMAPs are actually fiber. So,
Right.
So that's one thing to think about. So I would say that would be, microbe accessible carbohydrates. Now, in terms of dietary practices overall, that recent review noted that when we look at the studies on the really strict vegans, so like raw vegans, which are kind of a subsect of Seventh-day Adventism, that they did note some significant dietary deficiencies. So the extremes, and that could happen with carnivore as well, even if we're just looking at a minimum at fiber, probably avoiding the extremes is a good idea. So finding a diet that you can adhere to that is not super extreme and contains microbe accessible carbohydrates, those are really the only, I think, significant recommendations that I can make right now. Now, there's a number floating around of eating 30 plants per week. And that comes from a study from the American Gut Project, which is a really interesting sort of citizen science sourced research project where people send in fecal samples with self-reported data about their dietary practices. And they found that eating 30 plants per week was highly correlated with increased microbial diversity compared to people who were eating less. The other thing that they don't mention is that it correlated also with antibiotic use. Yeah. So again, I don't hang my hat on that specific number of like 30 plants per week, because that was an interesting correlation, but we don't know really, what else are those people doing. So I would say increased plant diversity is probably a good thing, but that's really the strength of the evidence that we have thus far. So that was only 3 things.
That's quite all right. Okay. When we see these infographics and pictures that say like drink apple cider vinegar for weight loss and drinks, these anti-inflammatory celery drinks and fruit smoothies and stuff, because they're going to improve your gut health. Is there any truth to this, right? Or are these too good to be true drinks really just that?
Oh, yes, absolutely too good to be true. The celery juice thing really cracks me up because it's like, what special medicinal properties does that have versus eating a stalk of celery? And the answer is none, but I don't know. Some people are just super dynamic and like great at getting people to buy into things. Otherwise, we wouldn't have cults. So clearly, like you're good at what you do, man. So that, and then apple cider vinegar. I really find it funny when people are mixing like their alkaline water with like their lemon juice or apple cider vinegar. And it's like mixing an acid and a base, and then like you're putting it into your stomach, which is filled with hydrochloric acid. And apple cider vinegar is not going to be more acidic than the hydrochloric acid, or so people are like, oh, take ACV for like improved digestion or weight loss or whatnot. Now, I think this comes from studies looking at, I think an Examine has looked at this too, examine.com. So there might be like weak evidence that it might help with insulin sensitivity. But like with the weight loss thing, it was like these people are experiencing extreme gastric upset because they're drinking a large amount of apple cider vinegar before their meal.
Yeah, probably not recommended to be chugging like a 40 of apple cider, Yes, yeah. So it's one of those things that's like, if you enjoy it, I actually kind of think apple cider vinegar is kind of tasty. And so they've got like sipping vinegars and things like that. If you enjoy it, just like, people get on like the kombucha train and whatnot. It's like, oh, this is a super, awesome miracle drink. And there was a tongue-in-cheek systematic review published on the effects of kombucha, like the health effects. Yeah. And there was one study in it. And it was like, that's kind of silly. The authors know that's not really a systematic review, but it's still important to publish those things and say, hey,
let's not put the cart before the horse. Maybe this stuff is awesome, but thus far, we don't have the evidence to be able to support those claims.
Yeah, I kind of showed you my shirt there. I wore this shirt specifically for you. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's a bowl of pho with fermented. Was it? What's
like
the
fermented bean paste and kimchi? Or
kimchi?
like,
That's what it is. Yes,
yes.
yes. So,
Nice.
all right. So, we talked about like the myth of these things. They don't really actually have the impact of improving health. But let's talk about the myth of artificial sweeteners doing the opposite of taking away from gut health, right? So I already know the answer here, but we always hear like, it's rat studies, right? Or animal studies. And the things that people don't realize about these animal studies is one, in terms of like ranking evidence, like animal studies are even below like case studies, right? So it's probably some of the weakest evidence we have. Is evidence nonetheless, but it's just weak relatively speaking to other forms, right? But they also don't realize like in these studies where they correlate or look at artificial sweeteners' impact on gut health, they're doing like 50 times the daily recommended amount for, I think one study did it for 3 years. 3 years of absorbing 50 times the daily recommended amount. Like, no shit, there's going to be some bad results of that. But how realistic is that for a human to do 50 times the daily recommended intake of diet soda or, sweetener or whatever it is? Like, so like, let's break this down. Tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, so I did a couple Instagram posts on this, and I gave equivalents for meeting the acceptable daily intake, which is still 100 times lower than the actual dose that would result in some negative effects. And that averaged about, I think, 13 to 17 cans of soda per day. So if we're trying to multiply that by even 5 times, let alone 50, like how many cans of soda? So you're literally going to be drinking 2 cans of soda every hour for 24 hours a day. Like, don't sleep or just get an IV or something, so absolutely like super physiological doses. And I've even seen some authors point that out, that this might not be a physiologically relevant dose. So we can't really extrapolate. And so that's, really part of the problem. And then it's like the cell culture studies. So if you want to look at like the magnitude of effect, it's got an inverse correlation with translatability to humans. So put artificial sweeteners in cell culture. Oh my God, the cells like just die. And they do that anyway, no matter what you do to them. But it's like and then you put it into a rodent model, and at physiologically relevant doses, like they're really, really modest effects, if any. And then you give it to a human, and it's like in most cases just no effect.
Yeah, and I mean, like I want to point out here, like when they talk about like the human versions or the human trials, like they aren't having the humans drink that absurd amount of diet soda. They're just transplanting the cells. They're just transplanting the actual gut microbiome. So again, like it's not a 1-to-1 comparison there. We're taking cells from an animal, injecting them and then transporting them to a completely different type of animal and seeing results. And mind you, in these studies, like it's only 50%. It's only like 50% of those transplanted microbiomes that still result in like ending up in like a risk of cancer or something like that. It's still not 100%, and we're talking about absurd doses, and it's crazy the amount of like mass hysteria you see around artificial sweetener when all the evidence is quite the contrary. But unfortunately, we have people like Dr. Oz and some other people out there, Hyman, that are, have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of followers that say sugar is bad and it's like cocaine and it tricks your body. Yes. And people just gobble that shit up without actually checking any side of sources or citations or anything.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. There were some people who reposted what I created to groups and followers, and with captions saying like, see, I told you that artificial sweeteners are bad. And I'm like, wow, Your confirmation bias is so strong that you literally took evidence contrary to your pre-existing beliefs and like applied it in a way that somehow made it look like it was supporting you. And I was like, I think you've kind of misinterpreted what I'm saying here. You know, it's like they don't even read it. They're just like, oh, artificial sweeteners in the microbiome. This is bad stuff. And I'm like, literally the caption tells you that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So one of the other things I do want to cover here is because we know probiotics. Everyone's on that bandwagon, but let's go ahead and define three things here because the one probiotic everyone's familiar with, but probably less familiar with is probiotics and postbiotics and prebiotics, right? So you've already defined the one, but what are the other two?
Yeah, so the probiotic are the microorganisms that we would ingest for some benefit to the host. The prebiotics are nutrient sources for the microbes. And then postbiotics are products that microbes can produce, not necessarily that they have to be the probiotics that we're ingesting, they actually can come from our native microbiome. And those postbiotics could have some benefit to the host. So for example, short chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate looks to be the most beneficial. We have the strongest evidence for its benefit. So that would be an example of a postbiotic, something that the microbes are producing that may have a beneficial effect on the host.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So we've talked a lot about diet, but here's a question I have for you that probably doesn't get a lot of light in most circles. And what is the impact, if there is any, that gut health can have on exercise? And is there any evidence to show that exercise can have an impact on gut health? And if there is impact, is it specific to a certain type of training, right? Do we see different effects in cardio versus hypertrophy or power or whatever type of application we want? Is the science very new on this, or why doesn't this subject get more light?
I don't know, because this is like my favorite thing to talk about. It's really exciting, and this is definitely a very new area, but things are sort of coming out rapid fire now, which is really exciting. So I would say that our first studies were really in rodents, and we were comparing quite often the effects of either sedentary lifestyle to exercise, and then we might also compare voluntary exercise, so rodents running on a wheel that's provided, versus forced treadmill exercise. And so the idea, and it was also often applied to, can this be protective against the effects of a high-fat diet?
Hey, okay.
So a couple things that we found from that. One, that the effects of voluntary wheel running are more significant than the effects of forced treadmill running, but that could be an artifact of volume. So mice will run for hours on a wheel. You put them on a treadmill usually for about 30 to 60 minutes. They're super stressed out. So we don't see the same sort of beneficial effects. And when I say beneficial effects, really it might be a misapplication. We don't see the same responses, the same increases in diversity, and specifically butyrate producing bacteria. So those were sort of our early studies, our early intervention studies. Now, there really only have been a couple of intervention studies using exercise in humans looking at changes in the microbiome. And thus far, two of them have shown no effect, but one was in a group of elderly individuals, and we may actually lose some responsiveness as we age. So that could be an artifact just of age.
Right.
Now, in one study, they did compare the reactions of the microbiomes of individuals with obesity versus those who were lean. And it looked like the individuals who were lean, their microbiomes were more responsive to exercise, responsive being an increase in microbial diversity and an increase specifically in butyrate-producing bacteria. Whereas the individuals with obesity actually had higher baseline levels of butyrate-producing bacteria. So I think it's context dependent on whether having more butyrate producing bacteria are actually beneficial, because butyrate is a sign that we are better at extracting energy from the diet. So that was our intervention. But we have quite a bit of correlational evidence just from observational studies that have correlated an increase in microbial diversity to increase or a greater microbial diversity in individuals who have greater cardiovascular fitness or who are athletes compared to those who are sedentary, even with BMI and age and everything being matched. So that's pretty interesting. And again, we see specifically increases in butyrate producing bacteria. Now, those studies have been done largely we have a few in rugby players, cyclists, cross-country runners, and race walkers. And
what? Okay, hang on. Let's. What is a race walker? Please.
So race walking is actually a legitimate sport where you speed walk. You don't run, you speed walk, and that's your race. Yes, and that's exactly how it looks. That is exactly how it looks. So we have some compelling evidence in those cases. Now, I'd say the most recent evidence coming out, there have been a couple things. One has sort of looked at the importance of the microbiome in skeletal muscle function, and it could be, and they correlated a reduction in diversity or just low abundance with skeletal muscle dysfunction in rodents. And another one that came out that was super interesting looked at changes in both microbial taxa, so who's there, and also gene expression in elite endurance athletes, so people that ran the Boston Marathon, and then another subset of marathon runners. And they found that their guts were enriched with one specific group of bacteria, Veillonella, and so they took a specific species of Veillonella and put it into mice as they enriched these sort of specific but they can kind of engineer mice with like a specific core microbiome that's free of pathogens, and then they put a specific microbe in there, and they found that microbial enema improved their run performance. They found that the microbe was consuming lactate. Lactate was its sour carbon source, and thought, well, perhaps it's helping to clear lactate, and that's enhancing exercise performance. But it's not. They actually were not able to confirm that in the study. What they found was that as it was consuming that lactate, it was converting it to propionate, which is a short-chain fatty acid that may have served as an additional energy source. So that was really interesting to see that we have changes in microbes and then also just changes in gene expression. So those pathways were actually enriched after the marathon versus before the marathon. And that was actually confirmatory of previous results looking at changes in gene expression in marathon runners several years ago. So it's pretty interesting to see that there's just those rapid changes in gene expression in response to endurance exercise. Now, in terms of resistance training, we have very, very limited data. Thus far, really all we've looked at were diet-exercise interactions in a group of bodybuilders who were fiber deficient and eating very high-fat diets. And they found that greater fat intake correlated with reduced levels specifically of bifidobacteria, which is considered to be a beneficial microbe. And they found that similarly with cross-country runners who were eating a fiber-deficient diet, that increased protein intake was correlated with reduced diversity. So it looks like that potentially, although exercise can play a role in shaping the microbiome, that maybe diet has a stronger influence. Habitual diet would have a stronger influence potentially. But these are just sort of, what I'm postulating based on that evidence and what I've been sort of thinking about. And it just remains to be seen whether that's the case.
Right. I mean, like I could, the way it, like I kind of picture it in my mind is almost like a three-legged stool, right? Like, no one pillar stands on its own, right? If we have diet on one, and then we have exercise on the other, and we have another leg, gut health, right? Or taking specific supplements, which can be a minor role, right? Together, they balance the equation, right? But it's something that's not one is specific to, the make or break, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So something I keep wanting to ask you, and I keep forgetting, and it's when you touched on probiotics and how, and like it's really unless you have diarrhea or a specific medical condition, there's really no need to be taking one, and the importance of being strain specific. Um, it's the other thing that's very, very popular right now is powdered greens, right? Is this another thing that people largely waste their money on? Is this something that, unless you're deficient or or not even necessary at all? Because I mean, I see people all the time like, oh, like fuck fruits and veggies, I'm just powdered greens. Like, what effect is that something we need to do, or is it something we should stay away from? Is it case specific? What do we do with our powdered greens?
Yeah. So I'm writing a piece with Miguel from Revive Stronger on this. We've been chipping away at it for a long time.
Smart man.
Yes. Yeah, he's great. So we've kind of split it up, and I'm looking at sort of the specific ingredients of probiotics, we've touched on, and then digestive enzymes. Now, greens powders will often contain, dried powdered blend of various fruits, vegetables, maybe herbs, sometimes fiber supplements as well. And then, some artificial sweeteners just to be ironic, maybe some stevia or something.
Yeah. It's crazy. You really never know what you're going to find in there. One of my more recent podcasts that I just did with Chris was talking about the $400 million fine that was divvied out by the FTC and the FDA to GNC and Advocare and Herbalife and stuff like that for, they said like at best they found only 20% of their supplements had accurate nutrition labels. So yes, it can be very sketchy what's actually in there.
Exactly. And that's part of the way that supplements are regulated in the industry by both the FDA and the FTC in terms of, what we allow on the label, and whether we're, looking into the safety or efficacy of those claims. So the problem here is that, so it's kind of several fold. One would definitely be dosage. So how can we be certain that the level of specific phytochemicals, so that sort of the beneficial chemicals that we get from plants, would be equivalent to what we would ingest in a day? What about the fiber intake that we would ingest in a day? And then things like or the probiotics, are they, strain specific effects? Are they sufficiently dosed? Looking at the digestive enzymes. Well, digestive enzymes that are not enterically coated will not survive passage through the stomach. That means they're going to be broken down just like any other dietary protein, and they will not maintain their activity once they hit the small intestine. So most digestive enzymes are ineffective. There are a couple that are somewhat effective at very large doses with very small amounts of the offending food when enterically coated. So that's another problem, is that we're adding these ingredients that are probably not going to be effective, even kind of at high doses. Even if it was a sufficient dose, if they're not enterically coated, they're probably just not going to survive transit. And then we also run into the issue of, if we're adding herbal ingredients, not all parts of a plant are edible and non-toxic. So that's another thing to consider. What parts of the plants are being added to that product? Are we running the risk of, with some, like with Herbalife, hepatotoxicity? That was mostly due to really high levels of EGCG, I believe. So there are going to be, risks of just sort of wasting money, and then there, perhaps some potential health risks. I think there's also an issue there with just letting people think that they can replace fruits and vegetables in their diet and whole grains and fiber in their diet with just a beverage. We really don't have, strong evidence to support that. Now, that being said, do we have evidence that some dried fruit or vegetable products, when ingested, exert some benefit or some change? Yes, we do have proof of that. So I would say mechanistically, perhaps it's possible that at sufficient doses, some of those phytochemicals could exert some effect. But that's, I think, a modest claim. What I see the claims for them saying, regulates pH.
No, it doesn't.
Cures bloating. Yes. Yeah. No, there is literally a company, and I've put this on Instagram and been like, yo, tag the FTC. Like, this company is claiming to regulate pH, cure bloating, like just things that, I'm not going to name names, but blood cleansing chlorophyll. I'm like, do you guys read the claims on this? Like, come on, you've got to be like, really, this is just absolutely ludicrous. So it's like, even if the greens powder just said like, this is a tasty beverage that contains some phytochemicals that may have some benefit. Okay. But it's the claims that I really have such an issue with. They're just extravagant and absolutely patently false.
Wow. Okay. Powdered greens, just like probiotics. Okay. Largely
maybe even worse, because at least like probiotics, we can see like
worse.
There are confirmatory trials, but yeah.
Wow. Maybe even worse. Wow. Strong. Okay. I dig it. I dig the information. I appreciate it very much. So I have one more question for you. One more. Okay. And it's leaky gut syndrome. Is this real? Is this real, or is this a myth? Enlighten us, please. Okay.
So this is a physiological phenomenon that we can have increased intestinal permeability. Yes, that exists. Have we been able to create or establish a causal link between increased intestinal permeability and everything that people think that it causes? No. So intestinal permeability refers to, if we think of our intestinal cells as standing up next to each other like this, we want them to be very close together. Mm-hmm. And there are tight junction proteins that sort of sew them together.
Okay.
So with increased intestinal permeability, the tight junction proteins are affected in some way that reduces their expression, reduces their activity. And so we might get a little bit of a gap between those cells.
Okay.
And that allows for leakage of luminal content, so the contents in the intestine, to potentially pass through. Now, in cases of sepsis, we'll see entire bacteria translocate. That could be really problematic. But even in individuals who are not septic but may have type 2 diabetes or obesity, or eat a habitual high-fat diet. We can even see this evidence of this after a single high-fat meal challenge, that we see increases in something called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. Okay. So that's a constituent of the cell wall of specific bacteria, and it can leak between these intestinal cells and bind to immune receptors and cause what we call low-grade inflammation or metabolic endotoxemia. Now, the problem there is that we can define sepsis. We have a clinical range of when someone is septic, depending on like markers of inflammation and things like that, or LPS. Metabolic endotoxemia is just something under septic. We don't actually have specific numbers for it. And this was a headache when I was doing my dissertation, because I was like, how can I say that these people or these mice have metabolic endotoxemia? We just kind of know it when we see it, quote unquote. So this leaky gut, yes, the intestinal permeability, we can see changes in that in terms of the LPS, or changes in fecal zonulin, which is a protein that regulates tight junction proteins, but that doesn't correlate very tightly with other markers of intestinal permeability. We might also do a substrate test where we have a person drink something and then measure what is excreted in the feces and the urine versus what passes into circulation, because it shouldn't pass into circulation via any receptors that we have. It would only be between those intestinal cells. So we can measure this, but we find that it might change after a meal, it might change after exercise, it might change after heat stress. If a person has not had any of these tests done, there's no way to sense that you have quote unquote leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability. And there's no evidence that even though it could cause problems in terms of inflammatory markers, that would then prevent you from being able to lose weight. So, and we don't have evidence that, even though it may correlate, it certainly correlates with some disease states. We don't know whether that's a causative mechanism. So that goes for, autoimmune diseases, inflammatory bowel diseases, mood disorders, people are linking leaky gut to absolutely everything, and we just don't have that evidence yet.
Right. Is this something akin to like adrenal fatigue, where like
Oh,
every single like thing out there, oh, adrenal fatigue, oh, adrenal fatigue. No, it's leaky gut. Fooled you. Almost thought it was that, but now it's
yes.
leaky gut. Like
Yeah.
it's another just correlation, not equal causation type thing.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So I'm going to give you the floor right now. If there's any specific topic you want to bring up, let's do it now.
Oh my gosh. I want to speak also to the claim about healing the gut. So this is another thing people say, oh, I can't, you have to, before you want to lose weight or before you want to X, Y, and Z, you have to heal the gut. And to that I say, the gastrointestinal tract is an entire organ system. It's made of various types of cells that come together to form types of tissues, to form types of organs. So when you say something like heal the gut, I'm like, which part? And are you talking about the anatomy and physiology, the actual structures of the gut? Or are you talking about the microbiome? So it makes absolutely no sense, and it's just a buzzword marketing term.
Yeah, it's something akin to people saying like, "Oh, I have to go on a detox before I start going to the gym, or I need to start working out before I start going to the gym." Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, no, that's not how that works.
Yeah, it's the new slow metabolism. It's the I can't lose weight because I have a slow metabolism. I can't lose weight because I have to heal my gut.
Yeah, which part of the gut? What needs healing?
Yes, exactly.
Oh my God.
Yep.
All right. So, where can people find you?
So I am on Instagram and Facebook as Vitamin PhD. My Facebook is actually just kind of a copy of my Instagram. I'm terrible at like cultivating those environments. So sorry for the disappointment ahead of time. I have vitaminphdnutrition.com, which once again, it's really a list of just my podcasts and things that I've written. But if people want to reach out to me there, they absolutely can. Obviously, I am a nutrition coach with Renaissance Periodization, but I also do consulting via Vitamin PhD Nutrition. So if you are interested in sort of like weight management and performance nutrition, long-term weight management practices, that's definitely on the RP side. If you want to have some assistance in figuring out, why you're having some digestive discomfort, then hit me up on Vitamin PhD Nutrition. And then check me out RP Plus. If you use my last name, Fundaro, in all lower caps, you can get $20 off a year subscription to RP Plus. We also have the RP Diet Book 2.0, which has a little teaser section on gut health. So, and then I'll be in Philly this weekend to do a seminar.
There you go. I cannot recommend Renaissance Periodization enough. I have the Renaissance Diet 2.0, which is so encompassing and overwhelming, not only in just its quality of information, but the quantity of information, as well as the RP Diet app that is absolutely fantastic as well. So highly recommended. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We greatly appreciate your time. We'll see you on the next one, guys.